Hello and welcome. Today we're quilting the All-Border Quilt. It's the final project of the How to Quilt Beginner series from American Quilters Society. There is a link down in the description to the written directions and to the directions for the top. So let's get started. We're going to come up with our quilting plan. To do this, I've printed out a picture of the quilt. I've got some tracing paper, laid it over it, and with a pencil, I've just marked out what I'd like to quilt on these different borders and different sections. So this has kind of helped me come up with a roadmap of where I'm going to go, which means I'm ready to mark out my quilt. For a bit of the movie magic, making it all a little faster on my end, I've gone ahead and spray basted my quilt, but you're going to mark out your top at home before basting. And then I'm going to send you to the written directions for more instructions on how to baste later. So I've got a couple marking tools here. They're both water soluble. I have a blue marker for marking on my lighter fabrics, and I have a white pen for marking on my dark fabrics. The only important thing is that they're both water soluble. They're soluble in the same way, so that whenever I'm all done and ready for my marks to come out later, it's just going to take one process to get them out. Here in this middle section, I'm going to be following kind of the organic wavy lines in between the flowers. And so I don't need to mark those. I'm going to just visually follow along to the pattern whenever I quilt it. So I'm going to leave that blank. And then in this next border, this 4-patch border and into the first half of the double miter, I'm going to be doing some 1/4 inch sewing and stitching in the ditch. So I want to mark out those 1/4 inches. To do this, I'm going to use ruler and my marker. In these light eggplant squares, I'm going to be making a little 3-sided box that's a 1/4 inch to the inside. So I'm lining up my ruler right on that seam, and then from where that center is down to a 1/4 inch before the edge of that eggplant. I'm going to mark with my little marker, and then I'm going to move this, do the same along the bottom. And then to the other side. And that's going to mark out that square, and I'm going to keep doing that all the way down. And on the other side, I'm doing the same thing in these kind of fun multi-prints. And it doesn't show as well with my marker on camera, but whenever I get to quilting, I'll know basically what I'm doing. The markings just to kind of help me keep precise to the piecing. And you'll see here too, I can line up that 1/4 inch all the way down my center line. That's going to help it look really straight through every part of the quilting. And here I'm going to come in a 1/4 inch into that first part of the double miter, and then come around this navy square by a 1/4 inch. I just keep going on down like that for the whole border. And once I get done marking that border, I can move to marking the next section. We're going to mark our navy cornerstones now. To do that, I'm using my white marking pen. And I've already drawn this one on because I really want you to be able to see this. It goes on transparent, and then as it dries, it becomes white. So as I start drawing, I wouldn't be able to see it, and then it would become white. So if you don't notice it first, don't worry, don't go over the line 100 times, just give it a minute, let it dry, and then you'll be able to see what you've marked. So it takes a little bit of patience, but it's still just such a handy tool, and it has such a fine line. I really enjoy it on these darker prints. So we're gonna mark all the way around like that. We're just doing a little 1/4 inch mark to the inside of that square. And then we're going to start coming in and marking our 1/2 inches. And we're going to do that one more time all the way in so that we get these nice concentric squares. My next border is the small part of the double miter, that dark fuchsia print. And I want to stitch mine in the ditch. That is whenever you stitch right next to completely butted up to a seam. On this one, I've pressed my seams to the inside. That way I'm going to be able to just sew right up next against it. And I'll show you what that looks like when we get to the quilting process. But because I'm already just following that seam, I don't need to mark that spot. That takes us to that pieced border. It's got our little flowers every so often and that nice striped print. Following my batting guidelines, I know that I can quilt up to 4 inches apart, but no more than that, or else I'll run into structural issues. So these blocks are 4 inches square, so I'm going to be able to just kind of stitch around them. And then I want to follow the line of my stripe. It's a slightly waved organic line. And so I'm going to measure, make sure everything is within 4 inches, and then I'm going to go ahead and not mark that one because I can just follow the print. So here, that's about 1 inch. That one's about 3 inches. This one's also about 3 inches. And it's kind of on like that down the line. And I see that nothing is bigger than 4 inches. So I'm set on that border. For this last dark fuchsia border, I think it'd be really cute to have some squares on point going down it. And we want to start that with a square in the corner. It's a 2-inch border. I can see this as I hold my ruler over it. And so I want to find that halfway point, which means if I bring my ruler down to the 1 inch mark, I can mark right at that point. And that's going to help me get started. I've already started marking this one, but I wanted you to be able to see really easily where we were going with it. So I've marked 1 inch from that corner. I would then be able to take my ruler, line up between those 2 points, and mark that spot again, which it is there. Once you have that spot marked, you're able to take your ruler and at that 45-degree line, lay it against the seam allowance and just kind of push it on up until you get to that point you marked a moment ago. And you're just going to mark down that. And then you do the other way. So I'm lining up that 45-degree angle line to this outer seam, getting it lined up to my marks, and I do that again. And that creates my first little X. I would do it again going this way, and that would finish that square. I'm going to keep drawing just to show you what that looks like, but as you do this on your quilt, I'd really love it if you start in one corner and then the other corner, and you work your way towards that center point. Because as we get to that center, if your border isn't exactly the size we're expecting, you're going to be able to make some choices on how you want it to come out. If it's really close but needs a little bit of adjustment, that's where using a water soluble is really nice because we can just use our little spray bottle, fix it up, and make a second little run of it. Or if it's really far apart, you can either create a gap that looks really purposeful because it's in the center, or do an even smaller little crisscross diamond in that middle. Whatever you decide to do, it's a lot easier to do it in that center where it looks really purposeful than getting out to the corner and going, what am I gonna do now? So I'm going to keep showing you that marking and we are going to get back to it. For this last border, it's a big, beautiful print, and mine is the same as my center. So I'd actually like to repeat the quilting I did in the center and just follow wavy lines in between these flowers. Because of that, I'm not going to mark out this border. But if you do, just draw out what you'd like, and then we'll get to quilting. We're getting our machine all set up to quilt. I've got my thread in there that's going to coordinate with the quilt. I've got a size 90 machine quilting needle in, and I'm going to change my foot to a walking foot. It looks like this, and it's going to install. And the really great thing about this foot is that as it stitches, that raises up and down. It moves these little feet, and it kind of creates feed dogs from the top, so that you end up with these feed dogs coming down from the top and your real feed dogs coming up from the bottom. And that grabs the fabric and moves it evenly, which is really nice with quilting because we have 3 different layers we're trying to move at the same pace. So let's get that installed and then we'll start quilting. So I've turned my machine off. That's for safety purposes, so I can't actually start sewing while I do this. And I'm going to take with a little screwdriver, I'm going to unscrew this screw until I can take my foot off. So then I'm ready to put the foot on, and I'm going to bring it around, and it needs to go over the little bar up above your needle and around your shank where that screw is. And once I get it around both of those, I'm just going to tighten it down. Be sure to check your manual for any specifics to your machine, but this is a pretty common design. All right, I've got that all tightened. It's on there securely. Everything looks right. It wiggles whenever I turn that with my hand wheel, so I'm ready to turn the machine back on. Now that I've got the machine all set up, I'm ready to start quilting. Our quilt is all marked out. I've basted the layers and we're ready to quilt. To start, you roll up the sides and make it so that you're at that center of the quilt. You do this in part so that it can go through the throat of your machine really easily, but also so you have something to hold on to while you quilt. You start in the center and you work your way out. I've started on my center and I've got just a little bit of this wavy line left to do. So I want to show you what that looks like, give you some tips for starting out a line, and then we'll just keep working through each of the different sections so you get an idea of what quilting all these different little motifs looks like. Whenever you start, it's really good to take a few little stitches before you start quilting. Because we're using a walking foot, it's trying to pull the fabric in. So if we just place a hand in front of it and place a little bit of pressure as we start to sew, that'll make it take a few small stitches, and then as we release that pressure, it'll begin to sew normally. So I'm going to do that here. So it's taking that couple little stitches, and it starts to sew. It's really normal to need to keep rolling that, so that as you're doing any like gentle curves, you're able to just move and manipulate it. And I'm not pushing, I'm just making sure that my quilt is going through at the same speed that my foot wants to. As I get to this edge, I'm just going to bring it right up to that edge, and I know I'm going to be stitching in the ditch later, so I'm just going to pull off, leave myself a nice long tail to bury later, and we're going to start the next section. I'm ready to start quilting the 4-patch border. I've got my lines all marked out, and I've started right up where the center matches that first border, and I've brought my needle down. I've left myself a 6 to 12 inch tail, just nice and long so that it's easy to bury later. And then I'm going to do the same thing I showed you a moment ago where I make sure it takes a few little stitches, and then I'm just going to be following my marked lines. As I approach that little pivot point, I take nice slow stitches. So I get right on there, lift my foot, turn, and this is where you'll end up doing more rolling. So I'm going to be taking and rolling my quilt a little more. I want to get it nice and even so that everything lays flat. Drop my foot again. Don't start quilting before you drop that foot. You'll be really sad and have a little ball at the back you have to fix later. So easy to have happen though. So once I've got it all lined up, I'm ready to go again. And see, even with this, I'm just going to kind of make a cute little wad so I've got something to hold on to. So I've got that going. I can start sewing again. All right, another pivot. I'm always pivoting with that needle down and my foot up. There's lots of just quilt wrangling whenever you're quilting. So take your time with it. You'll kind of get the mechanics of it as you go. All right, and then on this one, I'm going to be sewing right up to that seam line, and then we'll be stitching in the ditch down across it. And whenever I get this close for stitching in the ditch, I really like to use my hand wheel. That way I can make those minor little adjustments to get right on it, not a thread over, not a thread behind it. Then I've got my needle down, my foot up, and I'm turning it again. This is a moment where I turn my stitch speed down because I really want to take my time in the ditch. I don't want to get that kind of lead foot, like, oh, I got this kind of confidence going. I want to make sure I can go faster than I'm able to follow that stitch in the ditch. So I've got it all lined up. I've turned my stitch speed down, and I'm just going to take it nice and slow, following the seam. see by taking it at that nice low speed, I'm able to watch just ahead of the needle. I try not to watch the needle, it can be a little hypnotizing. But then as long as I'm watching just a little bit ahead of it, I'm always going to be going for the right spot. A little more rolling. All right, getting that next little bit lined up. I'm gonna do a little bit more stitching in the ditch until I get to my next marked line, and then we'll start sewing back out. But I'm gonna skip ahead and show you the next section. I'm ready to start quilting in my cornerstone. I've done these ring of squares, and whenever I'm doing squares that are self-contained, I'm going to start on a side, not in a corner. That way, as I begin and end, I'm stopping in a spot that's gonna be less noticeable than a corner would. I wanted to show you that as we pivot, there can be a lot of pressure. Sometimes it can move the needle a little bit or it'll skew our fabric. So as you're straightening out after a pivot, just take your time to make sure everything's relaxed and laying flat like it should be. Everything's aligned properly. And taking that little bit of time now is going to save you effort later because it's no fun picking out quilting stitches. I'm coming up to a part where I'm going to have a lot of quilt going into the throat. And so before I do that, I'm just going to start rolling it. And I kind of like to roll at an angle so that the bulk isn't just all one giant roll. It's kind of splayed out to one side. It makes it easier as we turn and as we start to sew. Because the two things you don't want pulling against your quilt are the weight of it with gravity, or it getting stuck in your machine and your machine having to fight against its own pressure. So we just always want to make sure it's really easy for everything to fit through that throat about the distance we'll be quilting. So I see all of this is going to be thin enough to fit through that throat. Now my ever sewn, it's a nice wide throat, which is lovely. So once I get that going, I can just keep quilting. As I make adjustments, I always end with my needle down. All right. And I'm getting up to that where I started with this square. It's gonna take me a second to get all the bulk through the throat. I'm just making sure I come back to where I'm all lined up. All right. So those last few stitches I have to take are gonna match up to where I began. And as I get to where I began, I'm just going to stop, take a nice long tail, and then whenever I go to bury those threads later, I'll be able to line them up perfectly so I don't have any gaps or overlap in between. So I'm just taking it to the right up to each other, letting my needle come up, and then I'm going to pull out and leave myself some nice long tails. In the next section, we're going to be traveling. That way we follow this stripe, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I'm stitching my way down in the ditch of the little flower block. And then as I get through it, I'm going to travel down the ditch of the next seam, which is that dark fuchsia border. I'm going to use my hand wheel here so I get it right on. Very good. For this next part, I'm going to be doing a little bit more stitching in the ditch until I get over to this first stripe I want to follow. And I'm going to stitch up there and then travel along and come down the other side. All right, and now Now we're gonna do that little stripe. And it's got a slight little wave to it. So I'm just gonna have some fun following that slight little wave, really emphasizing and working with the print. And then as I get up here to the ditch again, I'm gonna get all lined up. There we go. And then travel back along this. So I've already even sewn through this part of the ditch, but I'm just gonna sew over it again, and that's traveling. And it's called traveling because I'm traveling to the next part I want to quilt. And we've arrived at our destination, so I'm going to pivot again. And then I'm going to continue that on for the rest of this border. We're ready to quilt our dark fuchsia border. It's the one where I drew a bunch of little squares on point. And what I love about this design is that it's actually continuous line. So I can just follow it around one side, doing one angle of it the whole way through, and then come back and do the other side for the rest of it. And that will create my crisscrossing X's. As we start to quilt this, I'm going to show you how to stop and start in the right places before you pivot so you get nice sharp points. And let's get to it. So to begin, I've put my needle down in the ditch just before this, and then I'm going to be sewing to this outer ditch to the other side of that fuchsia border. Doing just like before, where I take a few small stitches. So I'm going to sew down that line, just following my marked line. And then as I get to that little spot, I'm going to use my hand wheel. That's just really going to help me with my points. I'm bringing it down in the ditch. And then I'm going to lift just a little bit of a turn. I'm going to come across that line there. Get that all nice and straight. If you start to have a little too much weight on your quilt, just lift it up and set it on the table so gravity's not pulling against you as you're doing these straight lines. Getting to that point again, ending it out there in the ditch, and turning. And so by doing this, I'm able to create a continuous line, and whenever I'm ready to do the other side, I'll just come back through making the exact same angle stitches. Sometimes I like to put it over my shoulder like that. This really helps with the weight of it. When you get all done going one direction, just come back the other way. For the very last border, I'm doing some wavy lines following the organic curves in my print. So I'm going to do that and then show you a little bit more of traveling and then how to finish off before we get to binding. As I get out here, I've sewn out into the area where it's just batting and backing. And I'm going to use that space to travel in instead of sewing along the edge of my fabric, because I'll be basting that later and it's just kind of nice to be able to travel out here where it won't matter. I just go pretty quick over to where I want to start and then turn to where I'm going. And then as I get up here, I can also travel in that ditch over to the next spot I want to quilt. Once we get that border quilted, you're going to do a basting stitch around the edge. Let me show you what that looks like. After we've quilted everything like we want, we're going to baste. To do this, I have lowered my tension and lengthened my stitches, and I'm just going to be sewing 1/4 inch to the inside of the outer border. My foot happens to have a 1/4 inch mark on it. If yours doesn't, just pick a spot on the foot and follow that so you get a nice straight line. The final step is to bury the knot of all these long threads we have. To bury the knot, you start by threading it with a hand sewing needle. I like to use an embroidery needle for it. And then I'm going to lay the needle over where that thread comes in, create a little loop around it, and I pull that through. It starts to make a knot. I'm going to put my needle right at the base where that stitch is, and I'm going to pull that knot tight. So it's just a little overhanded knot. Then I'm going to come in. I've got this one kind of where it can bury into a seam, which is a really great spot to hide threads. But if you don't, just take about a stitch length. And then I'm bringing it under the first layer, maybe a little bit into the batting, but not through the backing. I don't want this to be visible. And then I just kind of bring my needle up and through to a different area. I give myself a little bit of space to work with. I'm going to pull that through. Then I'm going to pull until I feel the knot kind of go pop right into my fabric. Once I feel that, I'm going to create a little bit of tension. I'm going to bring in my little snips, trim it off right at the fabric, and then as I give a little rub, all that thread goes right back under that first layer, and I've buried my knot. That's it for quilting on the All-Border Quilt. Come back next week and we'll be talking binding and labeling to finish out this project. Thanks for watching.